Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm Simone Cavallaro, the director of the Stigler Center. We're very honored to host His Excellency Armando Varricchio for an address on Italy and the future of transatlantic relations. I would like to thank the Italian Consul General in Chicago, and in particular Consul General Giuseppe Finocchiaro, for their contribution to making this event possible, as well as Alberta Lai, Director of the Italian Cultural Institute. A few notes. Today we are on the record and video recording the event, so please silence your phone. Thank you. As usual, the views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. As you may know, the Stigler Center promotes and diffuses research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. We have many initiatives, including the Capitalism podcast, co-hosted by Stigler Center faculty director Luigi Zingales, who unfortunately was not able to attend today. He is abroad. Please check it out and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Back to this afternoon. We look forward to an insightful address from the ambassador, who will graciously take questions after his remarks. Please allow me to introduce him. Ambassador Varricchio presented his credentials to Washington in March 2016. He was previously head of the Economic, Trade, and Scientific Affairs sections of the embassy. Prior to this, he held many high-ranking positions in the Italian government and abroad. He specialized in European and transatlantic affairs at EU level and has significant experience in global issues. He graduated from the University of Padua, Italy, and entered the Foreign Service in 1986, and served as a diplomat in Budapest during the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Moreover, he was a personal representative at the G7, G8, and G20 summits on a national and European level. In 2014, he was promoted to the rank of ambassador and served as ambassador to Belgrade. He has received the highest Italian award, Knight of the Grand Cross, as well as many other honors from various countries. As you can see, his credentials speak for themselves, and we are delighted to host him today. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Varricchio.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to address here at the University of Chicago and to have an opportunity to share with you a few thoughts, particularly with this prestigious school and with the Stigler Center. It's great to see, it has been the case for a long time, a strong Italian contribution to these prestigious institutions. I was just having a fruitful discussion with the President of the University, and I was reminding that the connections between the University of Chicago and Italy dates a long time. Today, I will be giving you a sense of where Europe stands at this juncture and how our relationship with the United States matters. And I will close on a reflection on the role of Italy both at national and European level. And finally, I will be happy to take your questions. 2019, what a seminal year for Europe and for relations between Europe and the United States. In May, we'll be having the elections to renew the European Parliament, and we will be celebrating this year many historic anniversaries. The 75th anniversary since D-Day in June 1944, 70 years since the signing of the NATO treaty, the Treaty of Washington, signed on April 4th, 1949, and moving forward to the end of the year, 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, happened in November 1989. I was already a diplomat in those days. I was serving in Budapest, and I have vivid memories on how Europe was unfolding those days. But let's get back to Europe. and the historical mission of the EU. As you know, the European dream goes back to Charlemagne and has never abandoned the collective unconscious since then. The Treaty of Rome, signed in 1957, and the European integration in the past 60 years are the progressive realization of a workable model of the European vision. So we have a dream, we have history, but at the same time, after World War II, we try to translate this into a viable project. But the member states themselves cannot by themselves alone meet global challenges. This is the reality that we all acknowledge these days. And this is the reason why the EU is now engaged in a joint effort, because we need, on one side, to revive the European project. We have to make sure that this European project remains not just viable, but also able to in a way, speak to people's hearts and minds. But at the same time, we have to make sure that this project is given new credibility and cohesion to enhance its sustainability and efficacy. So the important question that we need to address are, which Europe do we want and which Europe do we need? Because we are, and you should be first and foremost, the European people. And as said, European people, reminding here the incredible words written at the very beginning of the American Constitution. We, the people. So we should remind that in those days, at the end of 18th century, a limited number of farmers, well-read, intellectuals, very much connected to Europe, they were speaking on behalf of the people. They were pretending to be themselves the people. Those days are long gone. Nobody these days can say we the people, because we are all the people. So it's not just, we cannot reproduce what our founding fathers back in the 50s, a limited bunch of great leaders that had gone through the tragedies of the first part of the century, decided to meet and move forward by signing a treaty. Those days are gone. Now we have all the hundreds of millions of people in Europe who want to have a say, who want to participate in this process. So the stakes are much higher today than used to be back in the 50s. And Europe, since then, is reflected in a multifaceted society, speaking many languages and following a variety of cultural behaviors. We don't have an official language in the EU. All the language of the states of Europe, the states that we call in our jargon the member states, have their own language, by the way. Once Brexit happens, English will not be anymore a language of the EU, because Ireland signed the Treaty of Accession in Gaelic. So we will have to rethink about all this. The many cultures and societies of Europe have gone through a steady process of integration of cultures, judicial and social systems. Member states pooled their sovereignty together in the areas of commerce, education, and social legislation. And these systems have gradually merged. Citizens of the member states of Europe are permitted today to travel freely within the EU and within a judicial common space. And the freedom of movement of people, even more than the other three freedoms that we have, goods, capitals, and services, has been the most significant achievement of European integration. Knowing European history, we are fully aware of the importance of borders, of frontiers. The northern border of Italy has been theater to terrible tragedies, wars. To protect a line sign on a piece of land or up in the Alps, our ancestors used to fight and kill each other. Now you can move freely without having any physical idea of a border between Italy and Austria, for example, or between Italy and Slovenia on the east. Freedom of movement, unknown to previous generations, and allow people to widen their understanding of different cultures and develop a shared identity. The fact that we are part of a common space gives you an idea of belonging. You don't have the physical impression of moving into an unknown territory because you're part of a common space. And for the last 30 years, the European governance has been anchored to the sheer economic dimension. Especially with the intensification of the economic crisis, the European governance has aimed mostly at holding sovereign debts within a set of parameters and at maintaining the inflation rate as low as possible, facing a strong contractions of consumes with stark social effects. So we started our integration back in the 50s, trying to create a more integrated economic area. We moved through different phases. We built a single market, and then we move on to financial and monetary integration. We built a common currency, but that was the moment when financial crisis hit Europe, and the citizens of Europe started to have second thoughts about the real value added of having a common space. And this, as always, translates into the political realm. And this is why European politics, in front of an unprecedented economic crisis, have been less visible. A 21st century Europeanism requires a return to the roots, to the founding reasons of the European dream, a political project, a democratic vision. The idea that we might enhance our project simply on economic terms doesn't work anymore. And this is why it is interesting to note that the next European Parliament elections are seen as a pan-European political campaign. And this is the reason why we have, and you face these days, a very, very direct confrontation among political leaders in Europe. They don't speak, they don't address leaders of other countries. They address other political leaders with the same kind of confrontation of open debate that is becoming a common feature in our domestic politics. European politics are now very visible, and this is the sign of a healthy democratic community. Of course, on one side, this is healthy. This is showing that we are living in a sort of common European political space, but at the same time, this is producing effects when it comes to relations among states, being Italy or France or Austria or Germany, or in Central Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, all the countries of Europe now are embarked in a strong political campaign. And political leaders try to go beyond national borders and try to find and enter into a broader European space. Before moving to the transatlantic relations, another doubt that we have, another issue which is coming at stake these days. We are all affected by doubts about the effect of globalization, a process that is not new. Globalization has always been there. Rome was the center of globalization. My hometown, Venice, was at the center of globalization for centuries, trading with Far East China, with Persia, with Africa. At the same time, Venice, in a way, found itself from being the center of globalization to the periphery when another fellow Italian opened the way to the west, crossing the Atlantic. So we are not living a new phenomenon, but we're living that with a new thinking and with other particularly mindset. So there is now a debate between globalization and regionalization. But what is the EU? Is an experiment in globalization, or is just a region? Is it a supranational dimension, or is a periphery of the big mass land of Asia and Europe? Think about China. And think about the fact that no single country in Europe, even the stronger ones, even the most important ones, are able to compete on global market. So there is a need to broaden dimension. And this is something that we are aware of, but of course we still have to find ways to translate into political reality. Shall I move now to the relations between the EU and the United States? The kind of relation that we call transatlantic relation. A stronger, more ambitious, and cohesive Europe is particularly necessary to improve its capacity to speak with the United States. We strongly believe, and I say as Italian and as a European, in the transatlantic relations. This relation represents the foundation of democracy prevailing over totalitarianism in the 21st century. And therefore, I think we have no choice but to continue acting to maintain the strategic value of our relations with Washington. Things that unite us prevail, values and principles are before anything and against any possible difference and incomprehension. You know that we are in the midst of a very difficult negotiation, trade negotiations these days between Washington and Brussels. This is not the first time we have this kind of negotiations. Since the very beginning, beginning of our project in the 50s, EU and US have been debating and negotiating. I myself have been many times privy of these negotiations. And when you negotiate, you do that, you know, with strength, determination, but always knowing that there is a shared interest in reaching a conclusion. This has to be a win-win solution. We cannot divide ourselves. We do that because of economic facts. The transatlantic economy is the largest, wealthiest market in the world, 1/3 of global GDP in terms of purchasing power, 27% of global exports, and more than 30% of global imports. But Europe and the United States' shared priority must remain these days to fight protectionism and make our economic and trade systems more integrated. And this is absolutely something that we have to preserve. But in order to achieve this goal, transatlantic relations cannot only be transactional. They have to evoke and keep in mind our economic values, illustrating their importance to our people. And they have to be transformational, rather, to allow us to steer the global conversation in the direction that is coherent with those values. Whether it is about free trade, the fight against terrorism, or the protection, particularly, and I underline this, of individual freedoms. But how do we create this strong Europe? In this context, I was saying no European state can by itself play a significant role. And this is why, for example, we do hope that Italy, that united European voice finds room in the United Nations Security Council. As you know now, because of the consequences of World War II, we still have 2 countries of Europe holding a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, which is the core of the global governance. The European Union has to know how to speak to the world. And certainly, we have no choice but to increase our integration in European defense. A common European defense is not antithetical to NATO. On the contrary. And it can also represent a useful complement, giving real, concrete demonstration that the EU remains effective and able to progress even for the security of its citizens. Being security now these days one of the top priority issues in our domestic political debate in Europe. But the essential way to guarantee a strong Europe is ensuring solidarity and cohesion through the collective responsibility of the member states. And I say solidarity and cohesion because the strength of Europe is its own diversity. We are just the opposite of the very famous American motto, e pluribus unum. We are not unum. We preserve, we cherish, we protect diversity in Europe. Differences in culture, in history, in religion, all the nations of Europe have these differences. And this, by the way, is not just limited to states, but even within states. Thinking to my own country, Italy, huge differences between the north, the south, the islands. In a way, we represent the very riches of Europe. And speaking about security these days, I cannot by mentioning an important issue, which is migration. Because migration and economic and financial governance are two emblematic challenges of the urgency to restore trust and solidarity among countries in Europe. Migration has always been there. Europe has aggressed, unfortunately, migration too late. Is it thanks to Italy that the migration issue has now finally reached the center of the EU agenda? We speak a lot these days in the political and academic debate about the new importance of geography. My friend Kaplan wrote a very seminal essay on this, and geography can never be skipped. It is there, and we have to accept, and dictates many trends, many events that are unfolding these days. But in the case of Europe, migration cannot be left to geography. We cannot only allow the countries that are facing the Mediterranean carry the burden of this historic trend. So the point is that all those human beings who arrive in any country of Europe, they arrive in Europe. A late Italian statesman, Aldo Moro, claimed that none is required to choose between being Europe and being the Mediterranean, since the whole of Europe is in the Mediterranean. And this principle is always to be recalled, also when the very same European security is at stake, from the backing of the political process in Libya to the European support to Africa and to the stabilization in the Middle East. The great Mediterranean Sea, the Middle Sea, is not a border. It's always been an area of cross-fertilization. It's the cradle of our civilization, actually. And a country like Italy is so rich in culture and heritage because it has been blessed by geography and being in the midst of this incredible piece of land and sea where so many different roads connect into each other. So we know what we're talking about, and we know that this is an old history. And this is why Italy is a committed promoter of the centrality of the Mediterranean for the future of Europe. The comprehensive strategy of Italy aims at offering a consistent and dynamic contribution to the stabilization of the main crisis zone, and particularly keeping an eye on the continent of our future, which is Africa. It is important to invest on a political and financial level in partnership with Africa and for Africa. Otherwise, illegal migration could be temporarily reduced, but never eradicated. Neither could be the repatriations improved. It is important to invest in Africa. It is important to make sure that this incredible continent grasps the opportunities. Every single night at the kitchen table, European families watching the news are watching news of hundreds of human beings trying to cross the sea and enter into Europe. But this is just the point of the iceberg. In Africa, there are millions of people who might want to move north and find a future into Europe. So there is no choice but to invest there, to create opportunities, to reduce barriers, and to fight, that open parenthesis here, the single most important root cause of migration these days in Africa, which is climate change. But this will be the topic of another talk. If Europe aspires to be a benchmark with regard to values, it has to be a promoter of a new approach to Africa's problem. Europe has to pursue cooperation inspired by partnership among equals. And Europe has to equip itself with financial instruments and mechanisms which are stable and long-lasting in order to control the migration flows from the countries of origin and the countries of transit. And the three Mediterranean routes must get political and economic awareness of equal intensity and consistency. From the east, and you all remember in the terrible, tragic summer when serious crisis erupted, hundreds of thousands of people moving through Turkey into southern Eastern Europe, then eventually into Central Europe. And later on, when we managed to find an agreement with Turkey, these flows moved to the central part of the Mediterranean and now to the eastern part of the western part of the Mediterranean. So you cannot stop this. You have to manage and harness the process. Because migration flows cannot be controlled by one country alone. This is why shared efforts are needed, and they have to involve the whole of Europe. But the wider Mediterranean impact, global phenomena like migration and our shared transatlantic security. This is a global border. It's not just a border of Europe, one which Italy is patrolling because of its geopolitics. This is a global frontier. This is where the transatlantic collaboration is essential for ensuring peace and stability to our citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. We have to make sure that we all understand that by stating that the interests of Europe and US are common and go in the same direction, what is happening in that part of the world, Mediterranean, cannot be neglected even here. Now we move to the relations between Europe and its own people. The Europe of the people, as we say. I mentioned the origins of the project back in the 50s, in the aftermath of the terrible war, and then our economic project to make sure that economy in Europe flourishes and develop. But first and foremost, Europe is a project for its own people. Because it is essential that EU invests more bravely on the youth, on education, on innovation, in a way to create a European people, so that the citizens of Europe consider themselves not just citizens of their own country, but of a broader space. Speaking about security, we mentioned migration, but of course economic security is equally important. So Europe has to make sure that we promote a fight against unemployment and support for growth. But where do we start? I think that it is important that we involve much more our people. as I was saying, times when decisions used to be taken within a restricted and limited number of diplomats or senior political leaders are over. Europe only works if and when our people are duly engaged, and so that the project becomes more democratic. It is important to build on this sense of community. To feel a community means to share values, perspective, rights and duties. And it means thinking about ourselves. Security is a condition for a peaceful existence. But there is no way that we can address security unless we work to promote education, a fairer distribution of opportunities, particularly for you, for young people. As our head of state, Mattarella, stated a few days ago, we must not be afraid to express good feelings that make our society better. This is important because we want to preserve our soul, we want to preserve our value. Europe only works when we are able to cherish our rights, we are able to make our democracies stronger. This is not easy these days. We are confronted with many challenges to individual liberties and to collective freedom because of the awakening of democracies, because of the impact of new technologies, because there are countries that present themselves as economic champions without cherishing human rights. This is something that as Europeans, because of our history, because of our role in the world, we have to resist. We have to be able to preserve our dream. We have to be able to preserve our heritage. At the same time, prove that we are able to be economically viable and effective. Otherwise, we will not be, we will lose attraction, and as our citizens will lose any interest into this project. We have to promote economic convergence, we have to promote investments, but make no mistake, for Europe to be not just a project related to a short period of time, only working in the aftermath of World War II, only working because of the exhaustion of our countries emerging after the tragedies of the two civil wars fought in Europe, World War I, World War II. If we want Europe as a project to have a future, we have to make sure that this project is viable, is able to meet present day's challenges, and is able to be accepted and supported by our citizens. This is the great challenge of our time in Europe. When our citizens go to the polls in May to renew this parliament and elect their representatives at the European Parliament, they can keep the future, their future, into their hands. Because the time, as I said, of decisions taken at higher levels are over. The reason why we have been able to build such an incredible experience, never attended before in history, to move beyond national boundaries and trying to build a stronger political player, has been done not just because of our strength in Europe, but because of this great determination and support of the United States. We'll never forget that twice the United States came to Europe to save Europe from itself, save Europe from our own demons. Back in the 50s, the United States has been instrumental in creating this integration, EU and NATO. But we think that probably there is less enthusiasm these days because Europe is given for granted and the United States, being a global player, is looking elsewhere. I think this is a big mistake, not just for Europe, but for America. Because only when Europe and America are together, work together, we are safer, we are wealthier, and we are able to protect our democracies. As Italy, we have always been a staunch promoter of transatlantic relations. Italy is a founding member of the EU, founding member of NATO, present-day members of G7, G20, a country that has strong connections to America because of our communities, 20 million Americans of Italian descent, hundreds of thousands of Italians living here, business, opportunities, scientists, researchers, scholars, many scholars also here in this great university. But I think that this is not just because of history, because we do think that we share the same values, and we do think that America has a great role to play. This is part of our daily activities, being in foreign policy, in business, in culture. I think that the future of transatlantic relations remains the priority of Italy's activity on the world stage. We want to do this here in this country and also in Europe with our fellow members of the EU. We know the stakes are high these days, that what you have been given for granted deserves a renewed interest, a renewed engagement. But I think that nothing can be achieved unless our people are supporting this. And speaking of this, I think that a great responsibility falls upon you. Particularly young people have to be the great source of inspiration. And I conclude my remarks before taking your questions with a reference to an event that might be a game changer for us. This is the decision taken by the British people to vote to exit the EU. It is not by chance that when the referendum took place, 30% of people of your age went to the polls, just 30%. So in a way, leaving their future to be decided by others. And I think that this has been a terrible mistake. I'm not prejudging the vote being Remain or Brexit. An individual takes his or her own decision. But I think that being engaged, being active, being part of the society, I think, is not just a duty, but it is the best assurance against the many uncertainties of our future. So the decision has been taken. It is impossible to change it. We will see how this will be unfolding. Nobody knows these days. We are approaching March 29th with many open questions. We'll see. There might also be a second referendum. I'm not that optimistic, but I mean, we'll see. We will manage this. We have been around a long time. Britain is a great nation, an old nation. Europe is engaged in trying to find the best possible way out. A vote is never a curse. A vote is a reality to be acknowledged and to manage. So we'll see how this will be unfolding. I'm optimistic that in any case, EU and Britain will remain intertwined and connected. There is no way to go. So Britain is there, here we are, and we will continue to be strong partners. But, and I get back, it is important that the citizens of Europe, particularly young citizens of Europe, are engaged because there are many stakes in front of us, but we have many opportunities. And as we say in Washington these days, we are living interesting times. So I think that when there is interest, people like yourself want to deepen their knowledge, to study, to have a clear view, I think really this was the moment when you became the real main player of our times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being here today. I have a kind of twofold question. The first one, you spoke on one hand about Europe and its richness in the diversity of each member state, and on the other hand, you spoke about the necessity to revive the European project. Don't you think that in a way these two elements are actually going in the opposite direction? More and more, I think that every member state is trying to close itself on its own, and don't you think Europe should rather go a bit more in the American way of a pluribus unum, trying to strengthen this cohesion rather than the diversity? And the second part, if you agree with this, is how really you would suggest to revive this enthusiasm about Europe. I think within this room probably everybody would agree that Europe is great and we see the benefit, but the majority of people, I think, probably don't agree with us and will share this concern in the election. So how would you go to increase this enthusiasm? Thank you.
Okay, so you went to really to the core of the issues. The first one, the model of integration. I do think that, having been myself for many years in Brussels, working in Europe and for Europe, that we have to take stock of what we have been doing in 60 years and try to readjust our model. Instead of trying to move and start from economic achievements and on incrementing our level of integration, moving to a different level, we have to suggest that these days individuals, communities, countries cherish diversity. Diversity is not a curse. Diversity can make Europe richer. There is no global thinking. There is not an homogeneous idea. Europe cannot be unum. Europe has to be different and diverse. And this is absolutely crucial. The alternative to Europe is not nationalism, which is a word which is coming again into the political discourse these days, the nation of Europe. Particularly in Europe, this resonates, you know, having or keeping in mind our tragic history. Nationalism has always been recipe to confrontation. But being a European, we know that nation can be an artificial space, because no nation of Europe is homogeneous. We have differences, we have local communities. I speak of my country. Or when I served in the European Commission, there was an expression not to relate to name your own country because you were working for Europe. So when referring to your country, you used to say, the country I know best. I'm not sure that the country I know best these days is my country, but you know, because things are changing, are evolving. But even within our own countries, France, Germany, there are many differences. There are Britain too. Britain, of course, we know British history, how diverse it is. So nation is not an homogeneous space. We have to make sure that in a larger common space, which has to be European, we can have our individual or community values duly represented, but at the same time matched with others. Because national space is narrow, national space is, in a way, recipe to an inefficient distribution of wealth. From an economic point of view, we need size. Size matters these days. We cannot compete with economic giants. No European country on its own can have a negotiating, bargaining power with others. The fact that our trade policy in Europe is run by the EU, we have a common trade policy, is because we need that size. We need that dimension to be able to compete in global markets. So Europe is efficient and has to be preserved. At the same time, I think that this is important to be explained to European citizens. For too many years, decisions were taken by, there are many expressions, the establishment, deep state, small groups. It is important to make sure that the process is more democratic. That's why these elections are seminal and tremendously important. So the way Europe works has to be adjourned, has to be changed, but the essence has to be preserved. There is no alternative. There is no country in Europe can be economically viable these days. And I think that if you want to preserve our wealth, our services, our rights, our universal health system, so what we have been achieving in so many decades, we need a strong European dimension.
Ambassador, thank you for being with us here today. I also have a twofold question for you. The first being, would you be able to comment a little bit about the challenges that the EU has faced in trying to bring in new member states? I'm thinking of Norway, some of the Eastern European states. And then also, if you can comment on what do you envision being the finished version of the European project someday?
So starting from 6 and moving up to the 28 these days. When I first went to work in Brussels, we were 12 of us. By the time I left, we were 15. When I came back, we started the process of the reunification of Europe that we have called, with a tremendous, horrible expression, the enlargement of Europe, like a pizza that you enlarge. Horrible expression. The idea was initially to accept into Europe 3 countries, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. In the meantime, Czechoslovakia broke up and split into 2 countries, so 4. But then we did realize that the fall of the Berlin Wall had left countries of Europe in a sort of no man's land. And the only opportunity for those countries to be part of a broader economic and democratic space was to accept them into Europe. And the process of enlargement started. And eventually move on, we accepted also 2 countries in the Mediterranean, Malta and Cyprus, and then 2 countries of the former Yugoslavia, Slovenia and Croatia, and there we are. But since those days, we always had in mind a big question: the borders of Europe. Where are the borders of Europe? Is geography, is geopolitics, is culture, is religion? Where is that? Very difficult question to answer. And when the question is too difficult, you better set aside and you think about it. So we decided not to answer in those days that question. But the question is there. I think that the only answer is that the limits or the borders of Europe lie where the European people is living. This is where our people are. We have new countries who want to be part of this area. But unfortunately, because of the many difficulties, the appetite for new accession now is weaker than it used to be in those days. By the way, the negotiations to enlarge Europe have not been easy. I remember in those days traveling around Europe. I was responsible for this, for the enlargement. I remember a conference in Poland, and I mentioned Poland because Poland has been amongst the new member states the most successful one. Poland, you have to remind yourself that when Poland joined the EU, Poland had the same GDP as Ukraine. Think about the difference these days. But I remember it was in this city in Poland, at a university, having a debate like this one. And a student, a girl, she raised her hand and she asked, but why should we be part of a union? We have just regained our independence after being, under another union, Soviet Union, for decades. So we want to preserve our identity. We don't want to merge into a broader space. And I'll never forget that question, because this goes to the core, to the essence of our project. How to make sure that that Polish girl feels herself at home in Europe without giving up what she cherishes and she wants to preserve. Her culture, her identity, her language, and her opportunities. So there is a very fragile equilibrium to strike that. That's why Europe, even these days, is a work in process, never experienced before. Because by the time Charlemagne was thinking about Europe, his ideas of Europe was European armies moving east. Even before him, the Roman Empire, the limes, the frontier, set by armies to the east or to the north, even in Britain. So wherever Roman armies were, that was Rome. We don't want to move our armies today. We want to move our ideas. We want to move our freedom. We want to move our values. We want to move our economy, giving opportunities. And we don't want to ask a pledge of allegiance. Nobody has to give up his or her own national or local or regional identity. So this is the uniqueness of the European project. We have new countries now that are negotiating. We have Serbia, we have Montenegro. Eventually we will have Northern Macedonia, now that we managed to reach an agreement on the name of the country. And then we have the longest candidate country, which is Turkey. Are we ready to give Turkey these days membership into the EU? Very big question.
Thank you for speaking with us. My question is, what are some best practices that you've identified at the negotiating table for creating those win-win agreements that you mentioned, especially in the face of intense partisanship?
Negotiating among countries, among Europe and US, what are you referring to? Or in general?
Yeah, why not Europe and the US?
Yeah. There is a debate these days about political discourse and readiness to accept different ideas. I remember my very first days, for example, in Brussels. We were 12 around the table, as I was mentioning, and there was a real interaction. These days it's different, because we are 28, so very often there is no interaction at all. Every single delegate reads his or her own paper instructions, and that's it. There is no interest in listening and there is no interest in trying to move forward and reaching a common ground. This is the essence of negotiation. Particularly when it comes to the EU and US, there is no other relation than this one. We are negotiating with many countries. We have diplomatic relations with every country in the world. But there is only this relation that is unfolding within a same political, cultural space where values are the same. So any agreement, any negotiations has to be a win-win. You cannot have someone, trying to overrule the other, because in the end, the loser and the effects on the loser will get back to you. We have a shared interest in promoting wealth, in promoting growth, in promoting spread of democracy, of individual liberties. We don't want to limit the other. This goes to the essence. There is no other relations like this one. This has never been before in history. Never been before history. In history, if you think about diplomatic histories, you had many agreements reached among countries. This has been always, otherwise, ambassadors would have been ineffective. So let's pretend that ambassadors have changed history, so that they managed to narrowing down differences and to allow heads of state to come to the table and sign treaties. But this is the first time that you have relations among countries that are part of the same political, ideological identity space. This is the first time ever in history. So, of course, we have to have a strong confrontation. We have to find the possible best way out for our own interest, but our own interests are, in the end, shared interests. This has changed completely the dynamic of the process.
Hi, thanks for speaking. You were talking a lot about the northern part of Italy. I am actually from Bressanone, here on an exchange, growing up with two identities within one country, German and Italian. And there's one comment that you made that stuck with me with English after Brexit not being an official language anymore. As a young person in Europe and going to school at the University of Vienna, English feels like it is European identity. Like that's like the center that connects all other countries, because communication is important. I see where you're talking about diversity, and that's like the awesome thing. Like I talk to French people, Spanish people, I meet them in Budapest or wherever, but we always have that shared feeling we're safe when we can speak English to each other without giving up our identities. So do you agree with me with that English really is probably the language of the shared language of the European people, or would you disagree with that?
I think this is a fact. I've been myself witness to this huge change for decades in Brussels. The working language, not the official, but the working language was French. When Central and Eastern European countries enter into the EU, and the northern countries enter into the EU, they shift the balance and we switched to English. So this is accepted. But do not forget that, knowing history, Greek has been for centuries the common language, the koine, as our ancestors used to say. And then in the Middle Ages, Latin, classes at universities, being Padova, Oxford, Sorbonne, or Pisa, or Alicante, used to be given in Latin, because Latin was the common language. And then French, for many years, diplomats used to speak French, heads of state used to speak French. Now English is, is a fact. But but language is not just an instrument, a tool. Language is a way to express your soul. So preserving languages in Europe is of paramount importance, because if we lose that connection to our identity, we lose part of our soul. So I think that is a two-tier process in a way, allowing people to talk to each other, being able to be part of the same space, tearing down barriers, but at the same time preserving. And this is why Europe might be somewhat ineffective and costly, because preserving languages costs. But I think that this is a battle worth to be fought. In your part of Italy, in Brixen, this is where, it's very, very telling. Preserving your language, but at the same time knowing the language or the country you hold a passport, but at the same time being a citizen of a broader space, which is Europe. In the great Habsburg Empire, languages were spoken. At the court in Vienna, they wanted the members of the family also to speak Hungarian, which was the other part of the... And you had that incredible real koine in the great part of the empire, which was Yiddish, because Jewish people were, a glue. They were spread around, and they've given so much to the community. So I think that Europe has to preserve this. Speaking and preserving languages, it what makes Europe rich.
We have time for one more question.
And the lady there, I thought. Yes.
Oh, thank you.
And then the second one there, we will do. Yes.
I have a question about the fact that you mentioned about the United Nations Security Council and the possibility that Europe will have a seat instead of the two current seats of the two current members of the European Union. And about that, on the foreign policy of European Union, how do you think that states that had historical influences on some areas will mitigate their egoistical need and will of having direct agreement, excluding European institutions like we have seen, and on foreign policy still? Do you think that we will see more trade deals organized across the Mediterranean, like the one that Europe done with Tunisia lately? Thank you.
I think that World War II ended a long time ago, and the United Nations Charter, the San Francisco Charter, I think remains guarantee that countries of the world find a place where they sit down and are trying to narrowing down differences. I'm a great and strong advocate of multilateralism. But I think that since then history has evolved, and we cannot allow any more peace treaties signed in the aftermath of World War II to dictate the equilibrium of present-day diplomatic relations. So the more Europe evolves into an integrated political space, the more we are creating a common foreign and security policy, the more we are heading towards a common defense policy. I think there is a need for a European voice. And being the United Nations, the core of the global governance, I think that Europe deserves to have a common voice there and a common representative. It is a process. Nothing is easy. I'm fully aware of the sensitivity of the issue. But I think that for the sake of Europe and for the sake also of those two countries, I think it is important to move in that direction. When it comes to trade, yes, of course, it is necessary. Not just with Tunisia, with Morocco, with Egypt, which is by far the most important Northern African economic power. We have to make sure that those countries are able to remain economically viable. We have a vested interest in having Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, eventually Libya, and Egypt being able to invest, promote, to be in global markets. Their economies are weak, need to be supported, and I think that this is in the clear interest of the EU.
Thank you, Ambassador, for being here with us today. My question concerns the European Common Defense System that you've mentioned quite a few times. I'm curious whether the European Union will be able to build a common defense system and whether Europe will be able to be responsible for its own defense as America turns gradually away from Europe in terms of defense and focuses on the Asian Pacific.
Europe has to invest more in a common defense. This has to do not just with the security and political dimension, but also when it comes to the European defense industry, having strong European champions when it comes to defense industry. But this is not a way to turn our back to the US. The contrary. We will be celebrating 70th anniversary of NATO early April in Washington. I think that NATO remains absolutely vital, both to the interest of the US and Europe. The border of the United States does not stop in the Atlantic Ocean, the eastern shore. The border of the United States include Europe. Our two areas are so integrated and have so many common interests that defense has to reflect this. So we do see the European defense policy not just as an alternative, but as a supporter of NATO and transatlantic defense. We have to invest more. The fact that we have relied probably too much on the United States for our own security as its own historic reasons. We have to do more on ourselves. We are aware of that, but not as an alternative. I think that the idea that Europe remains on its own is something which is not in interest, certainly not of Europe, but not of the United States.